So this right here is where we left off in the last video, and in this week's part we're going to be continuing along to push toward the final painting that you see here. I'm going to be going through a fair amount of information within this video, and I'm aware that some of it might be a bit dense, maybe even a bit boring at times, and so I'm making this video just for the smaller group of you guys that are interested in the techniques that I'm using here. And so if you fall into that group and are watching this one all the way through, I'm really happy that you're here, so thank you. Let's get right back into this painting. The first thing that I'm going to do here is something that I do in all of my paintings. I like to go back to an area that I worked on before and just add a little bit more detail into it, rework it a bit more. So what I'm going to be doing here is reworking, adding some more skin texture within this part of the cheek. So I want you to take a look at the skin textures here. We have a before and an after. If you're just starting out getting into drawing or painting, they probably look identical. There's not that much of a difference. But what I did here was to refine the area by adding some subtle highlights and a few wrinkles in here within the skin texture. And over the course of an entire painting, all these small refinements add up. Later on in the painting, when I paint in the right eye and the skin texture below it, I'll come back to this left cheek again and refine it a little bit more. And the reason that I'm telling you this is because painting, for me anyway, is about slowly getting to the final work. And to me, it doesn't matter at all about what sort of style or tradition that you paint in. It's always about those subtle adjustments and changes that happen over time. And as you do this, you'll notice that there's always something to improve upon. And even as I'm narrating this video, a month after finishing the final painting, I can see a ton of things that I can improve and fix, and to me that's what it's about. Constantly learning, always realizing that there's always going to be more there to learn about painting and people. And for these refinements, you can see that's exactly what I'm doing here. I'm mainly working into this area using my eraser. And what I'm doing is paying attention to the angle of those very subtle wrinkles that we see within the skin texture, and basically just drawing them out with a light amount of pressure, making sure I leave some gaps in between. You can see down here on the lower part of the cheek, I have some very subtle transitions there between highlight and shadow, and when you look at this from a distance, it gives the impression of skin texture. So let's move along to the next new part of this painting, which is going to be the nose. I'm going to start this one right in the middle, just below the nasal bone where the upper cartilage is, using that black paint. And what I'm doing here is first adding in some paint that's going to work as the texture underneath. I'm adding in most of this freehand, but as soon as I put down the paint, I immediately switch over to the eraser. The first eraser I'm using here is that softer one that I talked about last week. It's an amazing little tool to pull out some very subtle highlights, just kind of pull off the top thin layer of paint. I'm working here at the top, the dorsum or the bridge of the nose, just where the nasal bone is underneath. And you can see with this eraser, I'm kind of just scuffing into the paint using small circular motions, and I'm paying attention to my reference, trying to spot where I see highlights. The good thing about this eraser, like I mentioned earlier, is that it pulls out very soft highlights. But the negative thing about it is that it doesn't remove that much paint, just a very, very thin layer. So if I need to pull out a highlight that needs to be brighter, I'm going to switch over to the ink eraser like I'm doing here. This is the Mars Razor by Staedtler. It's an ink eraser. It's much more aggressive. So when I erase with this, it really cuts a lot more of the paint, revealing more of the gesso underneath, making the highlight brighter. But because of that, the edges of the eraser mark are going to be a lot sharper, and you're going to see a lot more contrast within the areas that you erase into. And more contrast on a micro level like this is going to look like more texture. As long as there's a layer of gesso on it, it gives the surface or the substrate a bit of tooth. And even if you sand it smooth like I do, that small amount of texture, that tooth within the gesso is going to hold the paint down. And for this technique, it's also the reason that I wanted to switch over to a paint that's a little bit stronger than the one that I was using before. So for this one, like I mentioned earlier, I switched over to the Schmincke Aero colors. I just ordered a bunch more again yesterday. I noticed that the paint binder is a bit stronger than the illustration line, so it lends itself a little bit better to the techniques that I'm using here. Another brand that I found is very similar to this is Liquitex, their acrylic ink line. And it's always fun for me to switch up paint to see what else is out there, what other manufacturers are coming up with. So for now, I'll be sticking with that Aero line just because I'm having fun with it and learning how to use it. As I work on the nose here, working my way down, I'm thinking of two things. One is the skin texture that I just talked about using the erasers and the airbrush. And I'm also thinking of the major forms on the nose itself, those planes of light and shadow. If you look at my completed painting on the left side of the screen, you'll notice that right here in this area that I'm highlighting, this part of the nose is a bit brighter because it's closer to the light source. And then of course to the right of that highlighted area is the shadow itself. Both areas, the highlights and the shadows, are going to have their own individual skin textures. So as I'm working on it, on the left side where the highlight is, I'm using more pressure into that eraser, pulling out more paint, making the whole area brighter. So I'm doing two things with that eraser, adding the skin texture, which is the micro details, and of course pulling out the major value of light all along the left side of the nose where the light is hitting it, just kind of forming it, sculpting the shape of the nose. And you can see right here, even in the early stages of painting this nose, that the left side looks like it's a little bit closer, and the right side looks like it's kind of rounding away from us. And because I am only using that one color, the color black, reduced about 20% with distilled water, I'm just being very, very careful not to spray too much paint. It's always a thin dusting of paint, erasing into it for some texture, and then glazing some more of the paint on top. If I add too much paint too quickly and then I start to erase into it, there's going to be a lot of contrast there within that skin texture. It's going to look very rough. That could be very useful for certain portraits. I use that all the time on other ones, but on this one, I wanted it a little bit smoother and a bit more subtle. Now, in order to round out a few of the features along the tip of the nose, I'm just glazing a small amount of paint along the edges. I'm starting here first on the lower part of the columella, right between the two nostrils, spraying a little bit of this black paint in there. Again, a small amount of paint is the most important thing. I like to spray a bit, stand back from the painting, see if I need to go darker. And I do want to point out here that because of the position of the camera, my airbrush looks like it's angled a lot more to the left than it actually is. Even with that very thin dusting of paint, you can see that it really starts to round out the nose. And this, of course, is the same thing in different mediums, whether it's charcoal or graphite drawing, oil painting, even digital. Using those values to shape and mold the forms that you're trying to render. The only difference is the application or the way that you apply different mediums. But in representational drawing or painting, like what we're doing here, the concept is the same across all mediums. And so now from here, what I want to do is bring out that highlight on the tip of the nose. It's a very bright highlight, not quite a specular highlight, but it really makes it look like this part of the nose is sticking out closer to the light source than any other part of it. And because this highlight is so bright, I'm going right in with the ink eraser. This is going to remove a lot of paint, but it's not going to remove all of it like an electric eraser. And of course, with all erasers on a gessoed surface, you can control how bright the highlight is by how much pressure you use. And so I'm using a moderate to a fair amount of pressure here just to start drawing in the major shape of this highlight. And within this highlight, there is of course going to be some texture. There's going to be some variation in values. As I pull out this paint, I am trying to overlap the eraser marks. This is an old drawing technique just to help the highlight look a little bit more natural so it doesn't look like sketches. Over to the right of this highlight is some very subtle skin texture, so I'm just going to paint this in freehand. And this is a good example of why I'm usually using a fine detail airbrush like this Krios 771 here. I just want to put on such a small amount of paint, so I'm just lightly pulling back on the trigger. That small nozzle and the low airspeed, it just doesn't release that much paint, so I could really control it. If I want these darker later on, I could just add some more of this paint, but it's just nice to build it up slowly. You get so much more control that way. This part of the video is in real time, and you can see here just how slowly I build up the paint and how slowly I work. This is why for most parts of my video I speed it up, because if you watch this live like we're seeing here, you can barely even see the paint being added to that canvas. And if I speed up the video like what I'm doing here, I think you can get a better sense of what I'm actually doing. But even though it may look like I'm working fast because there's a lot of cuts in this video and I have it sped up in a lot of parts, I'm always working very slowly. And of course, once that paint is down, I'm going right back over to the eraser, just working into the area, pulling out the major highlights where the light source is hitting the nose, and using less pressure within those shadow areas, so we still get some texture in there, but it's much darker. And of course, if anything gets too light, especially like in the shadow areas on the right side of the nose, I could just glaze some more paint over the top later on. And you can see at this point that the majority of the nose is painted in. It looks like a nose, and for most paintings, this would work just fine. But just like I showed at the very beginning of this video, I'm just going to refine it, work into it, just kind of clean up some areas that seem a little bit messy to me. And for me, the way that I always refine areas is using the eraser and then glazing paint. The next major part that I decided to work on here is the right eye. Now I'm going to speed through this because it's the exact same thing that we did in last week's video. I'm painting it the same way, using the exact same technique, starting from the center, adding in the iris and the pupil, and then just working my way out. If you want to see all of these techniques in full detail, make sure you check out last week's video. We started with the left eye on that one, and the same techniques are used throughout. No sort of stencil for these eyes or anything like that. It's all done freehand and using shields for the sharper lines. After getting most of this eye added in, I'm switching over to my ink eraser, and you can see that I have it sharpened to a very sharp point. It's almost like a chisel. I run this through my electric pencil sharpener, and with this, I could just come in and pull out some very, very thin highlights within the iris, and I could also use it just to clean up some of the edges here around the eye itself. As I start moving into the skin texture just below the tear duct, you'll notice that this area is a little bit darker. It's in shadow here. And within that shadow, there's going to be some very subtle highlights just showing off some of the skin texture within it. So I added in some paint, some small soft dots with the airbrush, and then I'm switching over to my electric eraser. And I'm just touching the eraser to the canvas to pull out some very bright highlights. When I use an electric eraser on something like skin texture, I know that the highlights are going to be way too bright. These aren't specular highlights in the skin like what you'll see in the eye just to the left of the pupil. These are subtle highlights, so what I do is I just go right back over to the airbrush and glaze some paint on top. You can get a little bit of control with the electric eraser. I know I talked about this a few times. If you just kind of float it off the surface and just slightly touch the edge of it to the canvas, but it's nowhere near the control that you're going to get from an ink eraser or a softer eraser. For a few of the wrinkles underneath the eye, I added a thin glaze of paint down first. This is the opposite of what I did in last week's video. And the reason I decided to do that is just because this shadow is a bit darker than the one on the left eye. Once I have some of that paint and texture down, I'm going to use a freehand shield just like last week, line it up with my initial drawing and spray a little bit of paint above it. That of course is going to be the shadow for a few of these wrinkles underneath the eye. You can see here that I made a mistake. I sprayed these a bit too dark. And even though that's obviously not what I wanted to do, it's not a big deal. I could use my eraser as I start adding texture in here. I could lighten up the area as well. After some work with the electric eraser right underneath that lower eyelid to pull out some really bright highlights, I'm coming back in with my ink eraser. And I just want to work very slowly in this area with that ink eraser. There's a lot of subtle changes here, so I want to try to replicate them. I switched over to an X-Acto blade for some areas that I want to be really bright. This way, when I glaze some paint on top, they're going to be much more visible underneath that thin layer of transparent paint. And then I'll switch back over to my airbrush and add a small amount of paint just below the lower eyelid, allowing some of the overspray just to kind of get up onto that really bright highlight above it. And now at this point, most of the major features of the right eye are in place, but it looks a little messy, so there's a lot of cleaning up that I need to do. This right eyebrow is really dark, so I want to get it in place a little bit earlier, just so I can see my values a bit clearer. Remember that surrounding values or colors are always going to influence the way that you see parts of your painting. I'm not going to paint in the entire eyebrow. You can see I just painted in the lower part of it just to get some of that really dark value in there. As I work my way down into the skin texture just below the eye, that really dark shadow that I just painted in underneath the upper eyebrow is going to help me see this area clearer. It's just going to help me see it a little bit closer to the way that it's going to be in the final painting. From here, I just want to focus my attention on all of that skin texture just below the eye. Because parts of that are in shadow, there's going to be a lot of contrast in here and a lot of detail. And then as it moves farther down into the cheek, the detail kind of fades out because more light is hitting it and there's just less contrast within that area. And so as I'm rendering the skin texture here underneath the eye, it's the same techniques of erasing and adding some paint on top, always in thin layers. And for me personally, this is always one of my favorite parts in painting, where I really get to focus on using the eraser and just basically drawing out the shapes that I see, drawing out the highlights using the airbrush for some of the shadows, and just kind of building the small forms within this micro texture. The reason that I love this part is that it's just so incredibly forgiving. I could rework this part over and over endlessly. There's really no way I could mess up this part of the painting. If I don't like anything within this area, I could just be a little bit more aggressive with that eraser, remove all of it, and start again. And that's kind of what I'm doing here on a micro scale. I'll add some skin texture, maybe a small highlight or a small shadow in there. And then I just back up for the painting, take a look at it, see if it fits in with the portrait, what I'm trying to go for. And if I like it, I'll just keep it, move on to the next wrinkle. And if I don't, I could just rework the area. I could erase into it further, or I could add paint on top just to kind of hide it. And so now at this point, I have most of those wrinkles in. It's definitely going to need some more work later on down the road. But what I'm going to do from here is start blending this into the skin texture surrounding it, the area of the cheek just below it, and the part of the nose that we worked on before. And this part is just going to be a lot easier. It's in a very bright highlight, the light source is directly hitting it, and there's just not that much texture compared to what we were just doing. So I glaze some paint over the top, always a small amount, and then I'm using my softer eraser here just to kind of scuff it up, build up some very subtle skin texture within there. This stick eraser is the pink one. It's the Faber-Castell 7056B, and the reason I like using it is just because it's softer and the edges of the eraser marks aren't too sharp. So what's nice about that is it builds texture, but there's not a huge amount of contrast between the area you erased out and then the surrounding paint. And as I mentioned earlier, as I add some paint into this right cheek, it's going to influence the way I see the surrounding parts of the painting. So there's areas that I worked on before, like the eye just above it and the nose to the left, I'm going to have to rework a little bit. Before I added this paint down, this right cheek was just pure white. It was just gesso. And because it was pure white, I saw those surrounding values differently than I do now with some paint glazed on. And I noticed that some areas of the nose needed to be a little bit lighter. So using that softer eraser, just kind of going over the areas, going over that texture again, just to help lighten them up. This is also the reason that a lot of oil painters will like to tone or stain their canvas before they start working, just to get rid of all that white. You can see your values a lot clearer against a neutral tone. Now, for airbrush painting, when we're using subtractive techniques, we don't have that option because subtracting into the paint reveals the white gesso underneath. So we need that white in order to work. So it makes it a little bit more difficult. It's just like drawing, like graphite drawing on a white piece of paper. But the good thing is that you definitely get used to it. What I like to do is always just remind myself that as I get further into the painting and I cover up more of that white gesso, I'm going to see the surrounding areas a bit differently again, so I'm probably going to have to go back and rework them a little bit. And so now at this point, what I'm doing is just working those transition areas of the nose and the eye into the surrounding skin texture that I'm building up now, the skin texture of this right cheek. Again, you can definitely see in the completed painting on the left side of the screen that a lot of this right cheek is in a pretty bright highlight. The light source is directly hitting it, so there's not that much contrast or texture within this area, but there is still a subtle amount, so I am going to render that. The key here is just a very small amount of paint so it doesn't get too dark, and then lightly drawing into it with the erasers. And now for this part, because a lot of it is so subtle and I didn't put too much paint down, I'm going to be using the softer eraser quite a bit here. Again, you just have to remember that when you're using a softer eraser, it's not going to remove that much paint. So you just kind of have to work slowly with it. It's going to give you a lot of control, but it does take some time. It's a little bit slower. But you can see here how I can even start to blend some of those darker areas just around the eye and the nose into this brighter highlight on the right cheek. The edge of this shadow is just a bit too sharp, so you can see I come in with that softer eraser and just kind of work along the edge, just kind of blend it into that surrounding texture. And if you're patient with this, you can get some really subtle blends with the eraser, just like you can with the airbrush. Of course, it's more work. The airbrush does it naturally, but if you take your time with the eraser, you can pull it off. Looking at the right side of the face here, you will notice that the right side of it, where the form starts to round away, is a little bit darker. That, of course, is because it's in a shadow. We also have a fair amount of facial hair in here. It's a bit out of focus, but you can see the beard just kind of runs up the side of the mandible, the jawline, right up into the hairline. So as I work the skin texture down, you can see that I added a gradient here. I made it a little bit darker on the right side where the facial hair starts to build up, and then I applied less paint on the left side where the highlight is hitting the cheek. This way we get some of that rounded form. Now the very important thing here is to get a smooth and subtle transition from the skin texture to the facial hair. I'm blending this in using a lot of erasing here. You can see I'm erasing a ton into the cheek, adding some skin texture with that eraser. And then I apply less pressure on that eraser as I start working my way into the shadow, into the facial hair. So we get a transition here from the highlight to the midtone, into the shadow, into the facial hair. Just like painting hair on the head itself, you want the transition from the skin tones to the hair to be subtle. If it's too sharp, especially on the head, it kind of looks like a hat or a helmet. And the same thing goes for the beard or the facial hair. We don't want to make it look like it's pasted on or glued on. We want a slow transition from skin texture to hair. Because this painting is monochromatic, it's one color, I'm using a graphite pencil here, a 2B, just drawing in some of these small hairs on that transition point. And then I'll use my airbrush to glaze some paint over the top, specifically in the really dark areas where all this hair comes together and it's in a shadow. When it's in a darker shadow like that, you're not going to see that much detail, meaning you're not going to see that many hairs within this area. Just going to be some small transitions of some dark hairs and some light ones. So glazing some paint over the top just kind of sets that form in, just kind of rounds it away from the face itself. And then in order to blend this transition in a bit better, you can see I'm using a fair amount of erasing here, just using a light amount of pressure on that transition point just pulling out some lighter values in there. The reference is always going to be my guide here, so as I'm looking at it, I'm squinting my eyes, just paying attention to those major values of light and dark. You can see at this point that the transition here is still a bit too sharp, so I'm just going to erase into it, blend it further. And I'm also using a darker graphite pencil here just to draw in a few of the small hairs. I would say at this point, this side of the face is good enough. Just like I mentioned earlier, I will eventually come back to this after I paint in some other parts of the face, just in order to refine it some more and blend it in with other parts of the portrait as I continue along. So that's where I'm going to wrap this one up. I want to thank you all so much for watching this video. I do hope that you enjoyed it, maybe picked up something to use in your own paintings. And before I go, I want to say thank you so much to the generous support of the current channel members who help keep this channel going. So thank you so much, guys. We will be continuing this one up on the members page next week. It's really the same techniques over and over. We're just going to be using them to start painting in some of the eyebrows and then the forehead, just the area around the frontal bone. I hope all of you guys are well. I hope you had a really nice, enjoyable summer. Maybe you got to take a little time away. And most importantly, that you got to spend a bit of time drawing or painting. And I wish you all the best in it. So thanks again, everybody. I will see you back here next Friday.